What's poppin'? It's your boy Brad Pill Black, and today we are doing another episode in my series, PragerUgghh. For this episode, I will be going over their video, A Short History of Slavery. I've never seen it before, but by going off the description and the comments, this video will be precisely for conservative white men who need more talking points when sharing their ignorant-ass views of slavery and how we are still affected by it today. The type that low-key have white guilt over slavery and the other atrocities white people have committed in the Americas over the last 500 years, but are so fragile they need videos like this to be made to tell them that they did nothing wrong, and it's okay that they're ignorant of the history of slavery. Anyway, I've talked long enough. Let's get it.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner.
First off, shut the fuck up, Candace. Second, nobody has ever said, in good faith anyway, that slavery was invented by white people. Now, some people say that white people shit, but they more so mean chattel slavery in America. But slavery as a whole, no, everybody knows white people didn't create it. Slavery has been around since even before the Bible existed. Nobody is saying it started in 1619 or 1492. Then she does a poor attempt at whitewashing the history of Christopher Columbus while painting the indigenous folks as savages, blessed to be saved by the white man.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks.
She gave us the history of the word, and that's the first true thing she actually said in this whole video, and it only took a minute. She also had to add that they were white part too, so when white folks watch this and repeat it, they can just say my people were slaves too, as if it's the same thing as the modern slavery people face today. It's a false equivalence, but sadly it happens.
Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave-master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day.
So she is correct in the fact that over the last thousands of years, multiple cultures have utilized slavery, and most saw it as natural. The difference between them and what was happening a few hundred years ago in the Americas, in the West in general, was that their slavery wasn't race-based. And she ignores that point during this entire diatribe of hers. I know she is building up to a point for this video, but she has honestly said nothing of value yet.
Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery. As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved.
Slavery was important economically in the old world. Everyone knows that. She spent a third of this video saying slavery was a thing for thousands of years, done by multiple cultures, but don't blame white people for slavery. White people were slaves too. She keeps going on about how normalized slavery was, but seem to forget that people were also fighting against the institutions of slavery. Because, a lot of people don't like actually being slaves, even if it is normalized for the oppressors. Not everyone thought it was normal. Many saw it as the evil that it was. We know white people did not create slavery. White people weren't even a thing back then because that's a recent social construct. Did they need to invest so much time just to say slavery wasn't created by white people?
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution.
So that was a fucking lie.
Haiti. Haiti was the first country to ban slavery, and they did that in 1804. And yes, the British passed the 1833 Slavery Abolishment Act, but they still kept their slaves for like 5 years afterwards. Slavery has been around for thousands of years, and during that time, many people have ended slavery. So to say white people ended slavery is honestly some bullshit and just being dishonest. Especially when the US went to war with itself to keep slavery as a thing. 750,000 people died because the country wanted to keep slavery.
After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War.
White men did not end slavery. There was a combined effort of enslaved people, both men and women, abolitionists, and other people who eventually got slavery to end. Technically. I say technically because after ending slavery, which they didn't actually do, they just made it a punishment instead of a natural thing. Also, you're saying white men fought to end slavery? Well, who did they fight in order to do that? Did they fight black men? Asian men? Native American men? Eskimo men? No, they fought other white men. I know this is PragerU, but they got a black woman saying, "Bless the white man for ending something they started." The audacity, especially since we know the people of PragerU would have been on the side of the Confederates.
Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few. Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon.
It sounds like you're trying to make an argument where we should be grateful to white men and that they are morally better. And Candace, we all know your grift. You aren't here to tell the truth. You're here to make dumb fuck conservatives feel comfortable with their mediocrity and ignorance. Also, we aren't told about them because when we talk about slavery in America, the Persian Empire, or the savages, indigenous people she keeps bringing up does not matter. That's called a red herring. She is making the argument white people aren't bad to look at all the other evil things other people do around the world. Like, yes, that happened, but that doesn't mean anything when talking about slavery in America, when it was predominantly white people who had slaves and were okay with chattel slavery to the point that they would kill other Americans to keep it.
And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's a fantasy.
He was kings, though.
The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
You can bring up that they were black, but back then they didn't actually care about that. The Africans, anyway. Africa is chock full of diversity genetically and culturally, and to think that they're all going to act and think a certain way because they're black just kind of shows where your mindset is, Candace. Sit here and act like there were a unified people instead of the diverse groups they were is just being dishonest. They didn't see each other as just black, but from whatever tribe or country they came from. Also, those Africans may have sold slaves and traded our ancestors, but the Europeans still bought them en masse with gold and had such a demand for them, huge demand for them. And they bought them with gold, not just mirrors and gin. I understand she's trying to shift the blame of the Atlantic slave trade to it being the fault of the Africans instead of the white people involved, but this ain't it, sis. This is just more whitewashing to absolve white folk of the crime their ancestors did. They still bought them, and they still treated their slaves like chattel, and then screwed over their descendants for the next half millennia. On top of that, they praised the people who fought to keep them enslaved.
Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated.
Okay, so the Global Slavery Index of 2018 estimates that on any given day, there were 400,000 people living in conditions of modern slavery in the United States. And currently, there are 2.12 million prisoners in the United States, with 34% of them being black. Slavery in Africa is a big issue, but is being used to essentially disrespect Africa while simultaneously ignoring the number of slaves in the US, which is odd because if you go by per capita, the US technically has more slaves than Africa. That aside, I am not condoning the modern day slavery that is happening in the US or in Africa. I abhor it and wish I could do something about it, but it doesn't mean anything when conservatives like Candace use it to concern troll and use it as ammunition to essentially just praise white people.
African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that. Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago.
They aren't being purchased, but their labor is. Also, considering there are millions of slaves to the United States who produce goods for companies like McDonald's, Walmart, Starbucks, and much more, and businesses like Apple and Microsoft use Chinese slave labor, it doesn't make them much better. Like, you want to praise white countries for not having slaves, but then ignore they actually use slave labor internationally and domestically? White people did not end slavery, especially in the US. They just made it a punishment for criminals. Again, this is whitewashing history.
Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candace Owens, author of Blackout for Prager University.
Oh my God, shut the fuck up about black victimhood. The American dream was not made for us. It can happen, but it takes a lot more effort than it would for some mediocre white guy, and that's just facts. Like, she did this whole video slobbing the knob of white folk. So-called ending slavery, just to call black people victims, which we kinda are when we're talking about slavery and the effects of it, and some BS about embracing a nation that still fucks them over. Like, how do you say we have a victim mentality when conservative white people need to be lied to about history to make them feel better? This shit ain't our heritage either. It was forced on us. Who the fuck are these race hustlers and what do they have to do with history of slavery? Candace Owens is garbage and anyone who likes her can go catch COVID. Like, and I'm being dead ass. Like, for this video, the history of slavery, it was all just essentially her saying white people didn't start slavery, white people didn't create it, white people were slaves too, and you know, if you talk about it, you're probably just have black victimhood. Like, and it's insulting. This shit is insulting, bro. And I don't understand why people actually listen to this. But anyway, this has been Prager with your boy Brett Pill Black, and I wish y'all a good one and be safe. Peace.